Chapter 7, The Fork-Tailed Petrel. Do you know how often it snows in stupid Marysville during a winter? Once a week, maybe twice. And do you know on what day of the week it always snows? Saturday. Every Saturday for most of January and on into February. Every Saturday. You remember what I do on Saturday mornings? And do you think deliveries stop just because it's snowing and blowing and blizzarding? And the snow isn't turning to slush like it would on Long Island, and it's getting deeper and deeper, and the cold is so bad that Joe Pepitone's jacket doesn't help much at all, and my fingers are starting to stick to the handle of the wagon, so I have to pull Joe Pepitone's sleeves down over my hands, but I don't have anything for my ears, which are about to snap off, until Mr. Loeffler gave me this gray wool cap that Lil says looks great on me, but I think makes me look like a chump. But I wear it anyway because I really don't want my ears to snap off. And besides, did I tell you that Lil says it looks great on me? Every Saturday it was the same. I'd wake up and it would still be dark because the clouds were thick and it was already snowing hard. And it had been snowing hard for most of the night, so the ground was covered and the sidewalks and the streets too. While Lucas and Christopher slept, I'd put on about everything I had beneath Joe Pepitone's jacket, and then I'd put on the gray wool cap that Lil says looks great on me. And I'd lace up my sneakers and head out into the snow, and my feet would be cold and wet in 3 steps. Mr. Spicer always had a cup of hot chocolate for me to start off each of the runs, and I'd drink it and go out with the first load. In the beginning of January, I did this with the wagons, but pretty soon Mr. Spicer figured that I'd do a whole lot better with this old toboggan he had, so that's what I'd use, and it went a whole lot quicker. I'm not lying, but you can't believe how cold the wind can blow in stupid Marysville. Mrs. Mason always had a cup of warm milk waiting for me because I told her, like a chump, that Mr. Spicer always started me off with hot chocolate, and she wanted to be sure to give me something different, she said, so it was hot milk. I got used to it. Mr. Loeffler always had a cup of hot tea waiting for me. I got used to that too. Mrs. Daugherty always had a bowl of cream of wheat waiting for me. I did not get used to that. Phronsie whispered that it was good if you put a whole lot of brown sugar on it. It wasn't. Mrs. Windermere always had a cup of hot coffee waiting for me, black, which she said was the only way to drink it if you wanted to be awake to serve the god of creativity, which she needed to do a whole lot since she was working on a stage adaptation of, guess. Yep, Jane Eyre. I'm not lying. When I told her that the only people who read Jane Eyre were people who had to because their English teachers made them read it, and no one in their right mind was going to pay good money to sit in front of a stage and have all this acted out, she sipped her coffee and said, "Skinny delivery, boy. I'm not even finished with it, and people are already lining up to buy tickets." Can you imagine anyone buying tickets to Jane Eyre? Can you imagine Joe Pepitone buying tickets to Jane Eyre? Me neither. I spent that winter with my head down against the wind, pulling the stupid toboggan, my hands up Joe Pepitone's sleeves, and always having to go to the bathroom because of the cold and the warm hot chocolate, milk tea, coffee. But afterward, when I got back from Mrs. Windermere's, Lil would be waiting at the deli, and Mr. Spicer would heat up some chicken noodle soup for us, his own recipe with lots of chicken and onion, and I'd take off my sopping sneakers and lay them beside the radiator, and take off my sopping socks and lay them on the radiator, and I'd stretch my sopping feet as close as I could get them to the radiator, and I'd eat the chicken noodle soup until I was warm again, and then we'd go to the library where Mr. Powell was waiting for us, and where we had started to work on gesture, which, by the way, the Snorri Heron would have been good for, but it was gone now too because of the snow. I'm not lying. Stupid Marysville had so much snow that winter that the town ran out of money to pay for the plowing and the salting and the sanding. So the town council went over to the library like it was a bank or something and took a razor blade with them, and the next time Mr. Powell came in, the snowy heron was cut out. Just like that, and sold off somewhere to pay for more plowing and salting and sanding. If you're trying to get Audubon's pages back, and stupid Marysville is selling them off faster than you can find them, it gets sort of discouraging. So here are the stats for Volume 3 of John James Audubon's Birds of America, owned by the Marysville Free Public Library of stupid Marysville, New York. Total number of plates, 100. The Arctic tern, missing, sold to an anonymous collector from overseas. The red-throated diver in Mrs. Windermere's house. The large-billed puffin, missing. Mr. Powell won't tell me where. The brown pelican In Principal Petey's office, the yellow shank returned by Mr. Ballard, who was a good guy, the snowy heron, missing, Mr. Powell won't tell me where, total removed from Birds of America, 6, total returned to Birds of America, 1, total to be returned to Birds of America, 5. Terrific. When you're considering gestures, said Mr. Powell, you're not imagining the birds as if they're posing for you. You're imagining them moving across the page instead of staying put. Your pencil is going to show them not only at the moment of the picture, but the moment before and the moment that is going to come after. I looked at Mr. Powell. He started to laugh. Try this. You're not going to draw a picture of the bird. You're going to draw a picture of the bird's flight line. How do I do that? Don't think of the bird as a flat image. Think of it the whole way around, even the parts that you don't see. Then think of how all the different pieces of the bird are working with or against each other. Think how the body of the bird wants to fall, and the wings want to keep it up. Exactly. All movement relies on that kind of tension. You show the movement by suggesting the tension. And how do I do that? That was when we looked at the fork-tailed petrels. Things at Washington Irving Junior High School were going mostly okay. My geography, the story of the world, was as clean as you could expect after half a year. Mr. Barber still checked it out, leaning down over me when I was working on the chapter review map about India. I could smell his coffee, and even though it didn't smell as good as Mrs. Windermere's, which she percolated before I came, it still smelled pretty good. In world history, Mr. McElroy had found 8 film strips about the history of the Philippines. The record pinged away at us just about every class. Terrific. In English, Miss Cowper was throwing us into the introduction to poetry unit like it was all fired important as the moonshot. You know, there are good reasons to learn how to read. Poetry isn't one of them. I mean, so what if 2 roads go 2 ways in a wood? So what? Who cares if it made all that big a difference? What difference? And why should I have to guess what the difference is? Isn't that what he's supposed to say? Why can't poets just say what they want to say and then shut up? In math, Mrs. Burns selected a group of students who had shown excellence and promise to work together on advanced algebra. Guess who was in it? Lil too. You know how that feels? In Mr. Ferris's physical science class, we were distilling aspirins, very large aspirins, which by the time the last bell rang, Mr. Ferris said he needed. Clarence was rocking his little hoofs off these days because the moonshot was still go ahead, and it looked like it wouldn't be long before there were human footprints on the lunar surface, as Mr. Ferris kept reminding us. When we asked him if making aspirin was as important as a man going to the moon, he rubbed his head and looked kind of painfully at us and said, "Believe me, aspirin is pretty darn important." And in case you're wondering how things have been going with Coach Reed, January and February were mostly okay too. I filled in all the presidential physical fitness charts for him in both periods. He'd call out the numbers and I'd write them down where they were supposed to be. When he had to do the written comments at the end of the charts, he told me what to write, and I did. I told him maybe my spelling wasn't going to be all that terrific, but he said he didn't care. A few days into this, he bought me a new gym shirt so that I didn't have to wear my undershirt anymore. He handed it to me one morning after we finished a periods chart. "Thanks," I said. "My brother isn't talking much these days, and he dreams a lot." "Go shower," he said. "You'll be late for your next class." There are 2 fork-tailed petrels. They're in the middle of a green, stormy sea, and the waves are about as high as they're flying. They're heading closer, and their sharp beaks are open because they're calling to each other kind of desperately. "Look at the way the wind is blowing the waves," said Mr. Powell. "Anything odd about it?" I shook my head. "Look again," he said. "Pay attention to the composition." He was right. 2 winds were blowing the waves in 2 directions, completely apart. So how are the birds' bodies responding to those winds? The 2 winds were pushing them in different directions, but the petrels were using them to meet in the center of the picture. That's what the picture was about, meeting, even though you might be headed in different directions. All movement relies on that kind of tension, you know. Because of the snow, we missed most of Lucas's appointments in Kingston. My father said he didn't want to chance driving off the highway in this stuff, and he wasn't about to take a day off just for a doctor's appointment, not with Big Bucks Ballard breathing down his neck, so Lucas would have to do the best he could. My mother did the best she could by calling up the doctor's office and asking what to do, and filling the prescription for the ointment for Lucas's eyes and checking the stumps every day to be sure there was no redness or smell of infection. You can imagine what that was like. Lucas mostly sat around the kitchen with a blanket over his lap, not because he was cold. He didn't talk hardly at all. None of us could know what it was like, he said. We weren't there, so what's the point of talking? When he did talk, he was his old jerk self again. When I told him about the moonshot and how one day there would be a human footprint on the lunar surface, he said, "I guess they won't be mine." And when my mother asked me to run down to Spicer's Deli for more milk, Lucas said, "I'd run down for you, but..." And when Christopher said that he was thinking about going out for track in the spring, which is something like a miracle since Christopher has never gone out for anything in his whole life, Lucas said, "I bet I could run my legs off if I tried. Oh, wait a minute." Every time he said something, that was the last thing anyone said for a long time. Which is what had probably happened the second Saturday of February when I had been working on the gestures of the fork-tailed petrels, and I was starting to get them just right so that they looked like they were about to dance with each other, and I came back home and said to my mother and Christopher, "I think I got them dancing," and Lucas said, "I bet you couldn't do that for me," and the silence came down, and I thought of the yellow shank, and I said, "Shut up, Lucas." I'm not lying. I said, "Shut up, Lucas." He turned his face toward me. "What did you say? Are you deaf too?" I said. He threw the blanket off his lap. He tried to raise himself up in his wheelchair. "Listen, little brother, I can hear," I said. "I got my legs blown off, in case you forgot." "How could I forget? You tell us about it every day." I think if Lucas could have gotten out of the chair, he would have pulled my face off. My mother had her hand up to her mouth, but she didn't stop us. The thing about the fork-tailed petrels is that they only have a moment. The winds are blowing opposite ways, and each one is riding a different wind, and there's only this one moment when they can meet. It's all fired important. They can't miss it when it comes. "Doug," said Lucas. He said this in kind of a snarl. "You don't even try," I said. "Try what?" More snarling. "I can't grow new legs." "You have 2 arms," I said. "They used to be strong." "You used to be able to take me," Christopher said. "And the doctor said that you should try leaving the bandage off your eyes," said my mother. "Maybe I'm blind." I walked over to my brother. I reached for the bandage across his eyes, and when he felt me near him, he tried to stop me, snarling. But I was a lot stronger than him now. I hadn't thought about it, but I was. So I grabbed his arms, pushed them away, and pulled the bandage off. My mother started to cry. Most of Lucas's face was still the shiny pink of half-healed skin. His eyes glistened with the ointment smeared over them. No eyebrows, no lashes. His eyes blinked and blinked and blinked. "You want to stop me?" I said, or maybe I snarled. "Try. Hitch yourself up in that wheelchair. Try." He didn't move. He kept blinking. "Try," said Christopher. Lucas blinked again. He turned his face toward my mother. "I think I see you," he said. The next Saturday it snowed, but it didn't matter. Christopher and I carried Lucas into the pickup, and Lucas, my mother, and my father drove to Kingston early. Lucas didn't have the bandage over his eyes. He kept turning his face from side to side, blinking, trying to make things out, and he was smiling. I already told you about his smile, right? After the deliveries, I drew the fork-tailed petrels with smiles. "Birds," said Mr. Powell, "tend not to have expressions on their faces." "This is their one chance," I said. "In a second, they're going to be blown past each other, and who knows what will happen next." Mr. Powell leaned down to my drawing. "In that case, smiles are appropriate." But none of the Petrels' smiles could touch Lucas's smile or my mother's smile. When I got home that afternoon, or mine, probably, when I heard that the Kingston doctor really thought that Lucas's eyes might heal, and he was going to send him to a specialist down to Middletown. He was going to send him to some guy in New York City, but I set him straight on that, said my father. And meanwhile, the doctor had some exercises he wanted Lucas to really work at for his arms and upper chest, and Lucas said, "I may need your help, little brother," and I said, "Sure." He reached out his hand, and I took it, and we shook, and his hand felt strong. You know, I don't think the fork-tailed petrels are blowing past each other. The more I think about it, it seems to me that they're probably circling, like 2 wrestlers, and when the waves and the winds smack at them, they spread their wings and skitter around, and then they try to come back together again. That's what I think they're doing. On Monday, James Russell was counting my squat thrust for the presidential physical fitness charts when he said, "I hear you've been drawing birds at the library." "Yep," I said, kind of breathless. It's hard to talk when you're doing as many squat thrusts as you can in 4 minutes. "Audubon stuff," he said, nodded. "You know, some of the plates are missing from that book," he said, nodded again. I was at 63 and still had about a minute to go, which if you ask me, isn't bad. "I know where one of them is," he said, nodded again. "Principal Petey's office," I figured. I'd seen the brown pelican too. "Puffins," he said. I stopped the squat thrusts. "My father bought it from the town." I'm not lying, I added another 42 squat thrusts before Coach Reed called time. If I had James Russell's father's job, I wouldn't talk about it. Probably James felt the same way because he never talked about it. And when he told me what it was, he said that he was only telling me because I'd probably figure it out the minute I walked into his house. But I couldn't talk about it to anyone, he said. "Promise?" I said I'd keep his secret, and probably you shouldn't tell anyone either. James Russell's father is the first flautist of the New York Philharmonic. Do you know what my father would say if he knew that? And James is right. You could tell as soon as you walked into the house. I mean, how many houses have flute music playing on the stereo in the middle of the afternoon and loud? And how many houses have books about flutes right out on the coffee table that anyone could see right off, and sheet music everywhere, and this huge piano, and next to it a music stand with a silver flute across it? I'm not lying. You could tell pretty quick. What you might not be able to tell pretty quick when you meet Mr. Russell is that he is the first flautist of the New York Philharmonic, because Mr. Russell is bigger than Joe Pepitone and Mickey Mantle put together. And I don't mean he's fat, because he isn't. He's just huge. He stands over you like this little mountain, and he's got this dark, beardy shrubbery all around the peak, and arms like pines, and legs like oaks, and feet the size of small lakes. His hands look too big to hold anything but a boulder, one in each. And I said, "You play the flute?" And he said, "Sweetly and beautifully." Then he showed me. He was right. Sweetly and beautifully. He started with Mozart, who isn't as bad as you might think, then some Brahms, who is as bad as you might think, then some Joplin, who's good, and then some Aaron Copland, who Mr. Russell said was his favorite composer, even though he didn't write anything for a flautist. And then he did some Beatles stuff. It didn't sound exactly like the Beatles, but it wasn't bad. And when he finished, I asked him to play the Copland again, and he smiled and did. Copland knew how to say what he wanted to say, unlike certain poets I could mention. Then James took me upstairs. He had a house big enough to fit 14 of the dumps into, maybe more. His own room was the size of our downstairs, and he had his own bathroom and tile with the grout still around it. And on the third floor, they had this room that ran the whole length of the house, about as big as left field in Yankee Stadium, which I have walked on, by the way. And right where the stairs came up to this room, the large-billed puffins were hanging. Okay, this is going to sound dumb. You know how sometimes when you haven't seen someone in a long time and suddenly there he is and you look at him and for a second it's almost like he's a stranger, and then that second is gone and it's all the same? Sort of like when Holly and Hood came by and dropped Joe Pepitone's jacket off last summer. That's what happened, except that at that same moment Mr. Russell was downstairs playing the Copland piece again, and there were those fat puffins looking like chumps bumbling around like they had no idea how to get on in the world, looking dumb and stupid and so beautiful that I wanted to... Nothing. They're kind of dumb looking, said James Russell. Yeah, I said. I couldn't take my eyes off them. And still the music played sweetly. They don't even look like they can swim, he said. The music played beautifully. Tuesday after school, I went home to do all the homework that I wouldn't be able to do that night because Mrs. Daugherty had called and wondered if I could come over on such short notice. And now I had the Daugherty kids to read to, and we were up to this place where the spider is going to die and a pig has to get her egg sac. I know, it sounds dumb, but it wasn't bad. So I had to get all my homework done before I went, especially for Mrs. Verne, who had already dropped 2 people from advanced algebra because they didn't get all their assignments in on time, and I wasn't going to be number 3. But on Wednesday, I went home again with James Russell. It was raining, and we got pretty wet walking home with Otis Bottom, too, since his house is only a couple blocks away from James Russell's. And for the record, Otis Bottom's father has a job you could talk about. He's a doctor, which explains why his house is not on the same side of town as the dump. I guess that being a doctor and being a flautist with the New York Philharmonic pay pretty good. At James Russell's house, we visited the large-billed puffins like they were old friends. Then we played speed chess up on the 3rd floor, which I was no good at, but he didn't wipe me out too fast. And he had a great dartboard up there, and I only threw a few into the wall instead of into the target. And then we played regular chess, and I was better at that, but he still won. And all the while, Mr. Russell was playing Copland downstairs, and the stupid puffins were bubbling about in the water, sweetly and beautifully. On Thursday, I stayed late with Coach Reed to finish the presidential physical fitness charts. Thanks, he said, when he signed his name on the last one. Sure, I said. I stood up to go. Sweat it, he said. Yeah. How's your brother? Surprised. His eyes are getting better, I said. That's not what I mean. I know. He still dreams. Coach Reed looked at me a little while, his mouth working. Go on home, he said, and thanks for writing up the charts. Then the fork-tailed petrels flew a little closer. Do you dream too? I said. Coach Reed looked down. He started to fuss with a bag of softballs. A long time with the fussing. Then there was a kid, younger than you. More fussing with softballs. And an old man and a young girl, probably the kid's sister. I don't know. Fussing with softballs. They come every night. That's what it's like for Lucas, I said. He shook his head. I don't think so. Not like these three. Maybe they want you to do something, I said. He stopped fussing with the softballs. Maybe they want you to help someone. He looked at me. Maybe they do, he said. That's what I mean about the fork-tailed petrels, circling around and around each other until they finally meet. On Saturday, we had another snowstorm. Terrific. Before I even left the house, there was 8 inches on the ground, and I'm not talking light and fluffy here. I looked out the bedroom window and I said to Lucas, who was already doing his exercises at the side of his bed, I'm going to be soaked up to my knees in 3 steps. And he said, wouldn't happen to me. I know, sounds like the same old Lucas, but if you had been there, you would have seen that he said it smiling. I was, by the way, soaked up to my knees in 2 steps, and if it hadn't stopped snowing and the sun hadn't come out and the sky hadn't started to blue over the tops of the mountains, I might have said, forget it, and headed back home. But I didn't. I drank my hot chocolate at Spicer's Deli and then sat out, and Mrs. Mason was waiting with her hot milk, and I got through it. Mr. Loeffler had a cupboard door that was loose, a light bulb that needed changing over the basement stairs, and a cracked window pane in the bookcase that he needed me to take the glass out of very, very, very carefully, and which he couldn't do because of his shaky hands. Mrs. Daugherty was keeping my bowl of cream of wheat hot, and she had a special treat with it, she said. It was bananas. In the whole story of the world, bananas have never once been a special treat. Then I headed off to Mrs. Windermere's, where I knew the coffee was percolating. No matter how wet and cold you are, black coffee percolating will get you through it. But I was pretty wet and cold by the time I got there, wet and cold all the way through. And even with Mr. Loeffler's gray wool cap, which I only wore because Lil Spicer said I looked good in it, which you might remember, my ears were still about to fall off. I guess you can imagine what Lucas would have said if he heard that, but now he would have said it while he was smiling. The coffee really was percolating at Mrs. Windermere's, and the kitchen was that kind of warm that goes right into you, like a blanket. I could hear Mrs. Windermere typing. Probably Jane Eyre was falling in love with Mr. Rochester right there in her typewriter. And so I put away the groceries and took 2 cups down from the cupboard and poured the coffee and brought the cups into her study. I opened the door and set one down next to her. You could see the vibrations of her typewriter in her coffee, and I sat down and sipped up mine and was almost half done before she looked up at me. Jane Eyre is falling in love with Mr. Rochester, she said. See? But I'm not quite sure how to show it on stage. Maybe, I said, he should be over at a desk, drawing something. Drawing something? And she comes up behind him and sees what he's drawing, and she thinks he's pretty cool. What happens next? I don't know, I shrugged. He doesn't have any idea what to say to her. Maybe he should let her draw something with him, Mrs. Windermere said. Maybe, I said. Mrs. Windermere nodded, then turned quickly to her typewriter and began smacking at the keys. Her hands flew high, petrels in the wind. I sipped up my coffee until I was finished with it. I got up and walked around the table in her study. It was still piled high with books. It will probably always be piled high with books. But the difference was I could read them now. Not that I'd want to read these particular books, but I could have if I wanted to. And that makes all the difference. I'm not lying. But I don't know who would want to read these. Librettos of the great operas, snore. Life of Verdi, snore, snore. Aku Aku, which sounds like someone sneezing. History of the Old South Church, Boston, snore, snore, snore. Even percolated black coffee wouldn't keep you awake if you were reading these. I picked up Aku Aku and I looked at the book beneath it. Aaron Copland's Autobiography, Manuscript Edition. I read it again. Aaron Copland's Autobiography, Manuscript Edition. I picked it up. Mrs. Windermere was still typing. I opened the book. Inside the front cover, a sheet of music was pasted, handwritten. I couldn't read any of it. Maybe I should try that next. Mrs. Windermere stopped typing. What book is that? She said. Aaron Copland's. I said. The guy who writes music. Meaning the guy who tries to write music, she said. I looked at her. Skinny delivery boy, you are talking to a very old woman who doesn't think much good music has been written since Ludwig van Beethoven finished his 9th symphony. She turned back to her typing, her hands rose high. So why have the book? I said. Mrs. Windermere's hands were still high. My husband liked to collect quirky books. That one has a page of Copland's music written in his own hand, but neither he nor I ever read the thing. Me because I never wanted to, him because he didn't have enough time. Her hands came down. Mrs. Windermere, I said, don't make an old lady cry. What kind of ice cream did I order? Cherry vanilla, I said. She stood up. Let's go try some. Mrs. Windermere, I said, if you don't want the book much, I think I could use it. She looked at me. Do you like Copland? I do, but it's not for me. She peered sort of slanted at me. You have something up your sleeve, she said. I told her. Mrs. Windermere smiled, almost like my mother, which kind of surprised me. The god of creativity has folded his wings by your desk, too, she said. She took the book, held it lightly to her lips, and kissed it. It wasn't weird. It was beautiful. Then she handed it back to me. Nothing should ever sit and gather dust, she said, and we went into the kitchen and tried the cherry vanilla ice cream. On the way home, I carried Aaron Copland's autobiography, manuscript edition, underneath Joe Pepitone jacket so that nothing would happen to it. When I got to the library, I showed it to Lil and told her, but I didn't show it to Mr. Powell. Mr. Swedick, said Mr. Powell, I think I can accept having the patrol smile a little bit, but that is an out-and-out grin. I suppose so, I said. He looked at me, rather like what you're doing right now. He said, I guess, I said. Mr. Powell looked at Lil. And you too, young lady, he said. Lil started to laugh. She looked over at me and laughed harder. Me too. Then Lil came up behind me to see what I was drawing. She put her hand on my arm and squeezed. You know what that feels like? I think you two know something I don't know, said Mr. Powell. Lil squeezed again. On Monday, I went with James Russell to his house. Mr. Russell was playing Aaron Copland's music on his stereo. I call that fabulous. Mrs. Russell made us both sit down with a glass of milk. And I have a special treat for you, she said. I'm not lying. She really said that. I held my breath because of the last special treat at the Daughteries. But it didn't help because when Mrs. Russell came back, she came back with a loaf of banana bread. Banana bread. And James said, how about we have some jam with that? And Mrs. Russell said, jam? Then you wouldn't be able to taste the bananas. And James said, Ma, I hate bananas. And she said, but I'm sure that Doug enjoys them. And I said, I think I'm still full from lunch, so the milk's fine. And then Mrs. Russell picked up the plate with the banana bread on it. And you might not believe this, but she started to laugh and laugh and laugh until Mr. Russell came out to the kitchen to see what was so funny, and she showed him the banana bread, and he said, I hate bananas. And we all started to laugh until Mrs. Russell said, I hate bananas too. And you can imagine us all laughing until we were crying, and finally Mrs. Russell took the banana bread outside to break it up for the birds. Let's hope they like bananas. And then I showed Mr. Russell Aaron Copland's autobiography, manuscript edition, and he stopped laughing. Remember how I told you how big his hands are? How they could carry boulders? He held Aaron Copland's autobiography manuscript edition like it was a half-cracked egg. I've heard of this book, he whispered, but I never thought. He was talking like he would talk just before Mass. He opened the front page, looked at the sheet of music pasted in. It's in Aaron Copland's own handwriting, I said. Mr. Russell stared at it. Then he looked at me, smiling, and we went into the front room, and he put the book on his music stand, and he played the music from the page with his silver flute, sweetly and beautifully. Fabulous. When he finished, he looked at me and said, Where did you find this? I told him. He shook his head. I can hardly believe it, he said. Mr. Russell, I said, I have an idea. Here are the stats for the rest of that week. Number of times I wanted to tell someone, 150,000. Number of people I told, 4. Lil Spicer, my mother, my brothers. Number of times I walked by the library hoping that Mr. Powell might be in, 12. Number of minutes off the record for finishing the Saturday deliveries for Spicer's Deli, 17. Mr. Loeffler didn't have any chores to do, so that helped. Number of minutes it took me to get to the dump from Spicer's Deli and then back to the library, 12, probably a record. Number of seconds it took between coming to the library and Mrs. Merriam telling me not to run up the stairs, less than 1. Amount of time it took Mr. Powell to understand what I had. I think he's still working on it. We laid the large-billed puffins back in their place in Audubon's Birds of America. It became a little more whole than it had been before. Do you know how that feels? Do you think the Fork-Temple Trolls were dancing now? Not much more than Mr. Powell, who first danced around the room with me and then with Lil, and then we all went downstairs to tell Mrs. Merriam, and he took her hands and tried to dance with her, but she wouldn't have any of it. Even though I think she was smiling just a little the whole time, she was shushing him away. That night at supper, Lucas said he wanted to go to the library before it closed to see the puffins. Don't expect me to carry you up those stairs, said Ernie Echo, who was eating with us again. We don't, said Christopher. Ernie Echo looked up at him from his plate. Christopher stared back. Ernie Echo looked down. Once we get inside, there's an elevator, I said. Ernie Echo worked on his string beans. After supper, Christopher and I went with Lucas to the library. The days were finally starting to get longer, but it was still dark, and the first stars had been out for a while. Lucas slowed up toward them as we went squinting, blinking, trying to see. We carried the wheelchair up the 6 steps between the two of us, and it wasn't light. Then we lifted it over the doorframe and onto the marble floor of the library, where the wheels ran quiet and smooth. Mrs. Merriam looked up to see who had come in so late, and when she saw Lucas, she walked out from behind the desk and took off her looped glasses. This didn't happen very often, and she said to Lucas, "Welcome home." I'm not lying, she said, welcome home, like she was bringing him into her own kitchen or something. Lucas turned his face toward her and blinked. Thanks, he said. When did you get back? She said. He told her. Where were you stationed? Told her. Were you near Saigon at all? Nodded. When? Lucas tried to remember. Then she asked him, while you were there, did you ever hear of a Lieutenant Leonard Merriam? Lucas thought, then shook his head. I never did. She leaned down toward him and put her hand on his chair. He was stationed near Saigon. You might have heard of him. Lucas shook his head again. I'm sorry. Mrs. Merriam stood up again. She twisted her hands together. I didn't think you would have, she said. I never really did. There's thousands of guys there, Lucas said. I know, but your mother must be glad you're home. Thanks, said Lucas. I told Mrs. Merriam that we were going up to see the book, and she went to the bottom of the stairs to turn the lights on. And she watched as we went to the elevator. Lucas didn't exactly like the steel gate that we had to draw across, and he didn't like the way the elevator rattled around on its way up. And he really didn't like the sound of the pulleys straining themselves. And of course, at the top, the elevator stopped a couple of inches below the floor, and we had to pull Lucas's chair over the lid. So he was sweating and even shaky when we got into the room with the Petrels and the Puffins and everyone else, but he wheeled himself over to the display case and looked in. Mr. Powell had left the book open to the large bill Puffins, and Lucas stared down at them for a long time, trying to make them out. There's 2 of them, he said, right? He looked down again, and after a while he said, Lieutenant Leonard Merriam is MIA. How do you know he's missing? Said Christopher. I know, he said. Lucas looked at the Puffins. He leaned so close that his face was almost touching the glass. Not everyone gets to see who they want to see again.